Last month, Konami basically said, yep, a Shizu tier is basically going to be full power when the Tearlaments come out, which naturally raised a lot of discussions and debate about one of the most dominant Tier-0 decks in recent history coming to Master Duel. Then again, some of you have probably no idea what I'm talking about or what a Tier-0 deck even is, and it got me to thinking. It's better to show and explain. This video will be a historical video, talking about the various Tier-0 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, going off of the TCG and OCG. I'll come back to Master Duel later. Now, a Tier-0 deck is such a powerful deck that it actively becomes detrimental to the game. They take over tournaments, they're intensely hard to fight against, and usually result in a large number of cards getting banned. It's easy to claim some decks are Tier-0 when they first come out, but I think Tier-0 is something that's more so in hindsight rather than in the moment a lot of the time. Like, sure, this Reddit page claims Sprite was Tier-0 at that moment, but if only that guy knew what was next. So, enough introductions, let's get started. Our first Tier-0 deck happened all the way back in 2004, a much simpler time than what we have now. All we had to worry about were horrifying diseases, war, and Kanye West. Wait. Anyhow, the first example of a Tier-0 deck, no doubt in my mind and Konami's, was Yata-lock. For those that don't remember Yadalak, first of all, happy birthday. Second, Yata-lock was a combo where you'd get a monster like Sangan or Witch of the Black Forest on the field, then use Chaos Emperor Dragon to nuke the field and both players' hands. This would trigger Sangan or Witch and allow a search for Yata-garasu. Then you'd normal summon Yata and attack your opponent directly, triggering the bird's effect and making them skip their draw phase and thus completely unable to play the game with no resources in hand or field. This was the first deck of its kind and resulted in the first ever Forbidden list. There had been limited cards before, but this was the first time the game had flat out banned cards, with all 4 cards in the combo and other win buttons at the time being hit. Eventually, Dragon, Witch, and Sangan returned with erratas, as did Yata-garasu due to severe power creep over time. Nevertheless, Yata-lock was the earliest example of a deck so powerful it changed the entire game surrounding it, for better or worse. We wouldn't get another Tier-0 format until 5 years later with Teledad, a very unique deck and quite the dominant package when it was released. The goal was a simple one where players would get a variety of dark monsters in the graveyard to bring out Dark Armed Dragon, a monster with a not once per turn destruction ability, and using Emergency Teleport, you could bring out a level 1 Dark Tuner to make Stardust Dragon to protect Dark Armed Dragon from being destroyed. Bear in mind, this was before a lot of board breakers that didn't necessarily destroy. What made it such a pain was the combination of hard to remove monsters and crazy consistency, with plenty of engines in the deck that provided the ingredients you needed, as well as easy draws. Emergency Teleport was one, but several other cards like Stratos to get you Malicious and Destiny Draw just made it all the worse. With its heavy power, and the fact it wasn't Blackwings in 2009, Konami limited a lot of the cards for it, though interestingly didn't ban them, mostly because a lot of those components were needed for use outside of that deck. So if you've ever wondered why Malicious is at 2 or why Reinforcement of the Army is at 1, you have this deck to thank. Now, if that one didn't seem as bad, don't worry, we've got a real nasty one now. In 2013, we got Dragon Rulers, a deck fueled by one of the most comically overpowered archetypes, the eponymous Dragon Rulers. They could be special summoned from the hand or graveyard by banishing a total of 2 dragon monsters or monsters of their attribute, search another dragon of their archetype when banished, and had a variety of effects when discarded, making them not only wildly consistent, but also very oppressive, being able to build a heavy board while depriving your opponents of their field, as well as being able to build amazing rank 7 Xyz monsters like Drakossak and Big Eye, making them not only wildly consistent, but also very oppressive. And of course, I can't forget Super Rejuvenation, which replenished their hands for every dragon discarded by their effects. How bad was this format? The best counter to them was a stun deck of Spellbook of Judgment Jowgen Turbo. It was the one time you could show up to tournaments playing stun without worrying about getting your face kicked in. The result after almost a whole year of domination was all 4 of the Dragon Rulers getting banned, as well as Super Rejuvenation. Now, some of these cards have slowly been making their way back to legality, but I highly doubt we'll get all the Dragon Rulers legal too soon. Now, not even 3 years later, we get another ultra-powerful Tier-0 deck with the infamous Pepe deck, a deck comprised of the Performer Pals and Perform Mage archetypes. With the crazy ability to spam special summons like No Tomorrow, you could build an absurdly powerful field in no time flat. These cards just had endless comeback potential. And remember, there was no shortage of great rank 4 Xyz monsters or level 8 synchro monsters they could bring out at that time as well. What ultimately made this deck, however, was the sheer insane consistency it had. almost any hand could win you the game thanks to the likes of Plushfire, Skullcrobat, and Monkey Board. All of these cards led to some of the heaviest ban list hits in the history of the game in both formats. Now since then, with both Master Rule 4 nerfing Pendulum summoning quite a bit, and Konami's own apathy to Pendulum summoning these days, some of these cards have slowly been able to work their way back in, but never to full power because with modern day Link, Synchro, and Xyz monsters, this deck would be even more busted in today's format. But only a couple months later, before Master Rule 4 even came into OCG, we had to contend with Zodiac at the end of the year. I went over these guys in my video talking about why several of the cards are banned, but for a refresher, they were essentially a one-card combo that were absurdly consistent where it was almost impossible to brick with them. One card got you Zodiac Trident, which effectively put an end to whatever monster your opponent would normal summon. And if that wasn't bad enough, they could combine that deck with True Draco for even more disruption with the insanely powerful Masterpiece. And given those cards still had their field spell at 3 along with Terraforming at 3, you could see how they were dominant. In fact, for most of late 2016 and early 2017, the format was basically whatever deck you had combined with either True Draco or Zodiac, or both. And come the dreaded Master Rule 4, which severely nerfed non-Link summoning decks by making it so that the extra deck monsters had to go into that zone unless you had a Link monster out, guess what deck only needed that one extra zone? Come the April 2017 ban list in OCG and the next update a few months later, Trident, Barrage, and Broadbolt would all be banned in OCG and TCG. True Dracos themselves would have their boss monster and field spell also get hit, with Diagram being limited and Masterpiece being limited before being flat banned. But don't worry, we get another Tier 0 deck not even 3 months later. The mid-2010s were not a fun time for Yugioh. Late 2017 saw the rise of Spiral format. A deck that initially was rather ignored that quickly became one of the most powerful decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Under Master Rule 4. Spirals were not only able to use Link summoning to their fullest potential, farming out absurdly powerful monsters like a pre-errated Firewall Dragon, Spiral Sleeper Agent, and more to completely shut down your opponent's plays, but they were also very consistent with several ways of getting the combo going to cause a bad time for your opponent, such as a pre-errata to Ancient Fairy Dragon and a still at 3 Terraforming. You remember that sprites chart I showed at the beginning of the video? That's nothing compared to Spirals. Look at this. Look at this chart. Shout out to the 5% playing Infernoids. I hope you had fun. Spirals would dominate late 2017 and a lot of 2018 with more and more powerful monsters for Spirals being released before action was taken. It took the banning of Firewall Dragon and Ancient Fairy Dragon and the limiting of a lot of the main Spiral cards and Terraforming before Spirals calmed down. And in 2020, with the release of Magician's Souls, the TCG banned Master Plan a key part in the combo, long after anyone cared in typical TCG manner. Good job, guys. And thus, several years later in 2022, we've come to Tier Shizu. Tearlaments, of course, were already a very resilient deck with plenty of disruption, floating abilities, and negates, but they weren't always the most consistent. Then the Shizu cards came around and turned that deck into a monster. With tier cards having their effects triggered on milling, the Shizu cards provided those milling abilities all too easily. Couple that with the usage of the amazing Herald of Orange Light hand trap, which not only could negate something like Ash or Maxi, but also triggered the effect of an Shizu card to go wild and go into all the tier cards. Yes, even Maxi did no good against this deck. Given what tier, you're also almost always guaranteed a copy of their Protection Trap, which even deals with Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet, you can see why this deck was so dominant. In fact, the only hand trap that did any damage to this deck was Dimension Shifter, as it banished your opponent's card. However, interestingly, this appears to be one of, if not the only Tier 0 deck that at least gets a little respect. Mostly because there were other super powerful decks making the rounds at this point, and compared to mirror matches with the other decks, a tier mirror match was considered some of the most skillful and intense gameplay you could get. But regardless of how you personally feel, action had to be taken. With Kit Kalos being banned, a couple of limitations in the OCG, and a lot of limitations in TCG. And TCG not accounting for Cashier like the OCG did, leading to a new super obnoxious deck taking over the format. Because TCG. So there you go, a history of the various Tier 0 decks. There have been plenty of other great decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That were almost Tier 0, but I wanted to stick with the big boys, you know? You might have also noticed that I didn't bring up Master Duel as much. Mostly because Master Duel hasn't had a Tier 0 deck, surprisingly. We've had plenty of strong decks, but none to the level of any of the decks I talked about. Maybe it's the best of one format, maybe it's looser restrictions, maybe it's Master Duel's emphasis on trying out all sorts of different decks, maybe it's Max C holding off crazy combo decks. Now with Tearlaments coming, that could all change and Master Duel might finally get a Tier 0 deck, especially with them coming out at full power. But that remains to be seen. What about you? Have you experienced any of these decks? And if so, what did you think of them? Were any of these decks fun to play against, or were they torture? Let me know in the comments and please subscribe.